Hello, everybody. My name is Bridget Marty, and I'm a Senior Associate Director and Career Coach at the Carlson Business Career Center. Thanks for joining me for this video where we are going to talk about the element of interview prep related to behavioral interview questions and STAR stories. You may be coming into this having heard the acronym STAR before and hearing behavioral interviewing, but not quite understanding what the difference is between all these different types of interviewing. We're going to sort all that out. As you are going through this video series, always reminding you that our aim is to help you feel confident and competent as you go into applying and interviewing for roles. And preparing for the interview can be very intimidating. I've had candidates that'll say, I just downloaded the 1,000 most popular interview questions, and I'm just going to use that. I get that. I'd like to offer you a more strategic, focused, and time-saving way to do that. And that is how we discuss the importance of STAR stories and why we use those instead. If you were here for my last video, I talked about the different types of questions that will make up an interview. General questions, we have your closing questions, and in the middle, which is typically the heart of the interview, are going to be behavioral questions. And behavioral questions genuinely are looking to get to understanding past behaviors, how you've done something, how you've demonstrated your skills in project management, how you have built knowledge of the aviation industry, wanting to know how you've done it, creating a picture for the interviewer so they continually build confidence in you as a credible candidate who's competitive for this role. These types of questions will often start with, tell me about a time when you, or they may tee it up with something like, this role will involve working with stakeholders in the XYZ industry. Can you share an example of how you have led relationship building for a new company? So they'll tee it up with, here's the part of the role that you would be doing, and then can you give us an example of how you have done that? They may be very straightforward of share your experience with how you have done this. They can also be kind of sneaky with how they frame a question. One of the best skills to hone as a candidate is to listen to different interview questions and identify what is the competency. Whenever you are in an interview, take time to have a space to write the question down. Often just taking that moment to jot down the question and those key words helps to trigger your mind and think about what's that competency, like what are they actually listening for? It is also okay to restate the question back to the interviewer, to ask for clarity, to make sure that you are getting to the answer that they want. So as we mentioned, that behavioral interview, which is the most standard type of interview that we see, is going to be focusing on the competencies and skills that are required of the role, and then asking questions that help the interviewer uncover, hopefully as easily as possible, your experience with those. This is where you're highlighting transferable skills, interest in the area, work that you've done. Also, a behavioral question should have a very clear evaluation rubric. So it should be something that the interviewer can say, this was a really strong answer because I heard an example, I heard the skills that they were demonstrating, or maybe this was an okay, mediocre answer. They started to highlight a story, but I didn't really get a full scope understanding of what they did to really drive the results, etc. Companies have their own types of rubrics, metrics, but the thing about a behavioral question, in my mind, that separates it from a general interview question, a general interview question doesn't always have a rubric, but something that is in a competency-based, skill-based, knowledge-based should have some sort of way to evaluate, like 1 to 5. So you can see with this example, the requirement, competency, ability to maintain working relationships across the organization. So they noted what are some of the things we're looking for in a superior answer as opposed to a not so great answer. That's how companies can score you in an interview and have a more data-driven approach. As I mentioned earlier, these questions don't always come about in a very linear form. We'll have candidates come back and say, they never asked me a behavioral question. But then as they share some of those questions that were asked, it's like, yes, all of those are questions that your best answer, the strongest answer you can give would be one where you provide a specific example of how you've done it. So you would provide a behavioral answer. So you can see these examples on the screen. I want to highlight the ones in the middle. How do you prioritize competing priorities? And then how do you communicate to prevent misunderstanding? When we see that language, how do you, candidates think, oh, this is where I can talk about like how I might do this. That's fair in some way, but what's going to really make impact in the interview is creating a picture in that interviewer's mind and having them having the ability to jot down some data about how you've done it in the past. So for example, how do you prioritize competing priorities? Oh, so many priorities in that word. You can say, that's a great question. In my role as a mermaid, I don't know, I was tasked with doing A, B, and C during our last quarter. And this was how I went through and was able to prioritize. So giving an example of how you've done it in the past. You can also say, this is how I have done it. These are some ways that I've also refined that as well. That's where work with your coach. We're going to help you to refine some of those stories too. But be mindful. Ideally, you want to have an example for to really give some impact to your stories. So then, what kinds of stories, right? If I'm, I mean, what kinds of stories? What kinds of things should I be highlighting? How do I prepare for this, right? Very common question. First and foremost, look at what the employer is truly seeking in a candidate. You're going to find that through the position description. You're going to hopefully have chatted, networking contacts, alumni, recruiters, things that they know, maybe things that are new and trending. These are things they're really looking for in a candidate. They want someone with AI experience. They want somebody who's worked in South America market, things that might not be in that position description, can sometimes come up in these conversations, but we always start with the position description. What are the skills that you're seeing there? We read the verbs, that helps us find those skills. There's also, thinking about general kind of leadership, how are you coming in? What's the impact you're going to make as a leader and how you communicate and interact and engage with people. That doesn't necessarily list itself out as its own bullet point on a position description, but I would presume they want to have an understanding of those interpersonal human skills as well. They're just not always listed individually. So the way we approach this is taking a really broad look at the companies that tend to recruit from graduate business programs will often be seeking these top 10 skills on the left side of the screen. This is from an analysis of over 600 master's level business roles. And this isn't a huge surprise to those of us who worked with candidates, because when we read position descriptions over and over, we often see these same types of skills. So communicating, that can be communicating technical information to a non-technical audience, making sure you're creating open lines of communication, working in a team, managing a team, taking initiative, managing a project successfully. How did you tactfully do that? Team leadership. Not just I was the point person on the project, but how did you lead? Did you lead through strategic thinking? Were you building relationships and rapport? Were you coming up with innovative ways to do things? Were you offering emotional support when it was a tough time like COVID? Interpersonal, working through differences, cultural differences, communication differences, conflicts, creativity or strategic thinking, how you took a different approach to something that was, like a problem you were facing and you came up with a different angle or more cost-effective angle, working with different departments and teams and understanding what their priorities were and your priorities were, and to make sure that everybody was getting their needs met. Conducting an analysis, being able to dig into data, tell a story, find the nuance, being flexible and adaptable. These are the most common we see. I added a couple more to the right that I have heard of more recently that aren't on this list, but they're they're definitely right up there, which is managing through ambiguity. That definitely came out post-COVID or during COVID and afterwards. We faced a lot of ambiguity during that time, and they appreciate a story or getting to understand how you handle when there is no roadmap ahead of you. You have to just kind of figure out your way forward. So an example of managing through ambiguity is appreciated. A time that you demonstrated curiosity or growth mindset is also appreciated. It's showing that willingness to learn and to stay open and to challenge your own assumptions. And then finally, examples of how you have demonstrated your commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, whether that's in school, in your organization, but a demonstrated understanding and appreciation for the people that you're working with. So these are the general stories that we would encourage you to build. However, sorry, go back here. I don't need you to have a story for each individual one of these competencies. Like I don't need 10 stories and then 3 more stories off to the side. You won't really be able to remember all of those stories. Rather, we say aim for 5 to 7 stories or so, and recognize that one story can often be used for a couple of competencies. For example, I might have a story about during COVID needing to transition operations to be fully remote. And that story could be used to illustrate my communication skills, how I was adaptable, and how I took initiative. So depending on how I tell that story, it's going to highlight different competencies. So we have a wonderful tool on our website. It's also in the shared drive for those who are going through the Greenlight program called our Star Story Matrix. Big, beautiful Google Sheet matrix. At the top, you'll see here are all of the different core skills that are listed on that earlier slide. And here are sample questions or things the interviewer is going to be listening for. And so as you are drafting out Star Story examples, you can go back and identify, oh, this story is a great story for project management, teamwork, and something else. And so you can kind of code that on your matrix. And we love seeing your matrix when we're coaching with you because it helps us also see where you might have some areas that you need to boost. As you are building out those stories, use your resume, go back. That resume has lots of examples of times you've been amazing. Look at annual reviews, performance reviews, Clifton Strengths, leadership assessment tools, anything that's going to highlight some of the stuff that you're pretty good at. We usually want to pull in some of those stories. Now we're always going to have weakness or failure things as well, but really leaning into the things that you've done well. And then drafting that story out, like in real life, like actually drafting it out, not just drafting it out in your head, is important. It goes back to practicing stories out loud, typing the story, writing the story. That helps it imprint in your mind. So let's pivot a little bit as we are building out stories and highlight what a good story is, right? So we've kind of learned, here's the framework. We want to have stories that hit some of these basic competencies. We want to have 5 to 7 of them, and they're going to demonstrate experiences that we've had historically that illustrate our acumen in that certain skill. Then that's like the basic. But then we're taking it a notch up because you want to tell a good story. A story, an interview story, should be memorable for good reasons. And I want you to be memorable to your interviewer. So we're going to dig in a little bit to what are those elements that are really going to make a story go from just retelling something that happened to a story. Okay. So the formula, this is the STAR formula, begins with situation and task, or sometimes it's context, like they'll say C, but we use the situation and task. You have about 3 minutes or so to do a STAR story. An interviewer might say at the beginning of the interview, we have 10 questions, we've got 40 minutes. Let's go. And you can do that math. You're about 3.5 minutes per story. So for the most part, there are some exceptions with some of the consulting companies and some employers that will maybe just do 2 or 3 big questions. But for the most part, a company has quite a few skills they're looking to understand about you and things they want to know. So you're going to cruise through. So you have about 3 minutes. You set the stage very succinctly with a quick situation and task. This is the piece that the majority of candidates go way too long on. And that is because in our culture, we want to give all the context. I'm 100% guilty of that. I want to give you all of the context. I want you to know all the things that were happening somewhere, not in an interview story, but just in like life when I'm telling stories. But for the sake of an interview, if the interviewer, let's say, is asking a question about, can you tell me about a time when you needed to persuade others to see your way of thinking? What they want to know is, how did you persuade someone else to see your way of thinking? They don't need all of the backstory. They want something simple, such as, while I was working for the Carlson School of Management, I was part of a committee that was identifying new options and I was advocating to get this. Okay, so sets the stage. It's enough that the interviewer can kind of picture where we're going here. Then, much like a recipe, we're really focusing on the action steps, right? So a situation and task is kind of like, here's the core ingredients, preheat that oven, here's the different things that you need. But then the actions that's where we're walking through how to do it. And this is, again, how the interviewer is getting to picture what you did. The more they can picture what you did and they align to how you did it, the more you are saying, I am your candidate. This is how I did it. And they're thinking, yes, that's how we would want you to do that at our organization. So we're creating a sense of unity with you. So focusing on that step-by-step. What was and this is where you say words, first I did this, next I did that. And you can highlight things like, initially I was apprehensive to do this or that. However, I knew I needed to move forward. So I set this up and this was why I did it. You're explaining the process as it went through. You're maybe highlighting, this was a 6-week process. This was 2 days. We had 3 hours. So giving the listener an understanding of, is there drama here? Was this something that needed to get done immediately? You know, we had 2 days to do what was a project that was normally scoped out for a week. Ooh, the interviewer is going to be like, okay, I'm listening. We love a little bit of challenge, friction. That's what makes a story instead of just a retelling of events. So as you are drafting out the elements of that story, think about all the things that you did, but also think about, what were some of those barriers or challenges? We might not use them in the story, but they also could be good things just to remember about that story, because we could use it for a different question. Then we get to the landing, and that is where you are saying, here's how it resolved very quickly. It's usually even quicker than the situation and task. Because again, as the interviewer, I'm most interested in knowing how you did that, okay? Like how you went through it. And then the landing is really about, ultimately, we were able to provide the deliverable to the client. We received 5 stars, a 5-star Yelp review, and we were really excited to maintain that client's business. Great. Sometimes it's a really happy thing. Sometimes it's not so happy. And we maybe not going to highlight that in the result, because again, the focus is on like the action. There's also times where you'll get like a failure story or something negative. And that's where we can add like a learning, like the result may be a learning, you know, like going through this experience helped us recognize the importance of documenting the tips for doing A, B, and C. And so this is the basic framework. I use grocery store as an example for this. If I were to say, you know, tell me about how you grocery shop. Great. This last week, I was at Cub Foods. I had a list of 10 things and I had 6 minutes to get them done. Here's what I did. First, I went in the store, I grabbed my cart, I pulled my list out. I focused on the parts of the store that were going to be the most helpful to me. So I needed to start in produce. I then went to, I'm talking through how I'm doing it. You as the listener are like, why did she even go in the store? Why didn't she do pickup? You might be like, that's not how we would do it in our organization, or that's not a way that's going to be a value add to our organization. Or you might be thinking, well, that's interesting. How interesting. She organized her grocery list according to the layout of the store, which I did. So we're thinking as an interviewer, you're kind of listening. Do I align to that? You have that result or that learning. That's a very tiny example of like how a star story is. And that's not saying that there's any drama in it, but when we're telling how we've done something, it can be difficult to explain how you've done something that you've just done over and over. It's like walking down the stairs. Like, how do you explain how you do that? That's what makes star storytelling really difficult, because it's not the natural way that we tell stories like socially. It's a very specific framework because the interviewer is able to get the information that they need to move forward. Here's an example of how one of our candidates was able to draft out a story that she titled Hockey Nights. And you'll see on the left, she had very succinct bullet points. Now, when she was telling the story, she was obviously, making transitions and flowing between the bullet points. But this is a story that the way she drafted it out this way, and then she coded the skills at the bottom. So she said, hey, this is a story, depending on how I tell it, I could use for collaboration, communication, leadership strategy, etc. This was what worked best for her brain of how to draft out these stories. We want you to do what works best for you, but it cannot overstate the importance of actually drafting out the story and having that quick situation and task. What was the challenge? What was the problem? What were you called in to do? Having those actions that truly illustrate how you tackled the situation. And it's then tackled the competency or demonstrated the competency that the interviewer wanted. For example, if I'm asking a question around, if I say, in this role, you'll be managing multiple projects simultaneously, can you tell me about how you have gone about doing that? I am interested in how you have communicated project priorities, how you organize that information, what's worked for you, what really hasn't, what was that recent scenario you had that went well or didn't go well. So really making sure those actions align to the competency and then that result. So we have talked about how to build a standard star story and the types of competencies or skills that you're often going to be having stories based on: project management, leveraging data to provide recommendations, persuasion of others. The negative questions, I alluded to this on that last slide. This is also an area that can trip up candidates. So I wanted to add a little piece in here about that. Not meant to be the pain Olympics. They're not looking to make you feel uncomfortable or embarrassed. It's more about self-awareness and how you have worked through adversity or something tough. You can see these examples at the top. Tell me about a time you failed, a time you had conflict, some of your weaknesses. These kinds of questions can be really stressful to candidates. They think they have to have a huge failure. And I want you to like zoom out and think more about like, okay, I'm one person. What was a time that I just didn't do it? I could have done better, right? I failed to delegate, communicate, meet a deadline. I failed to anticipate something that you learned from, hopefully. And the same goes with, a time you had a conflict with a team member or a leader. It's where you were in an uncomfortable situation and you needed to really be thoughtful about how you approached it. And you're going to explain that answer to the interviewer where you're identifying, here's what went wrong, here's what we did, and here's that resolution. When I have the question about a failure, or tell me about a time that you did not meet expectations in the job, tell me about a time you failed, my preference is that you really tee up that failure right at the beginning. I want you to own it. Absolutely. I would love to tell you about the time that I failed to get buy-in from my leader before inviting 100 people to campus for a career fair. Oof, okay, because I'm going to take ownership of it. I need to be responsible for it and say, here's what I didn't do right, but here's how I worked to make it better, and to make lemonade out of lemons. I'm interested in early on, what was the mistake, the failure? How did you actually go about making it right? And then that result should be maybe what you learned from this, or how this helped to improve something going forward. The most common mistake with failure or negative stories is there is a focus on anything but what you did that wasn't at the best standard. So someone will like kind of avoid all the things and they give all this context about all these things that were going wrong. And I never hear them say, here's what I did wrong. They'll say like, kind of like the whole team, and they won't take ownership. That's just not realistic. We're human beings and we make mistakes. Okay. So, a final reminder, you have resources. We have the interview prep tool that I mentioned in an earlier video. We do offer interview prep practice with peer coaches during the academic year. You can also do practice with a coach with your peers. We have contract and industry coaches that represent different functions and areas. When we are preparing for that interview, sometimes you have an interview scheduled already. Other times you are saying, hey, I'm heading into a job search and I really want to get a head start on some of my stories. Leverage these resources, connect with a coach. We're always happy to workshop a story with you or help you build that first one, which I often call the bad pancake, because the first time we do something like make a pancake, it's not always the best one, but it's edible. And so the first time we tell a star story, we might put too much emphasis on one part and not enough. We just need you to be coachable, take the feedback. We're going to work with you and help you get it where it needs to go. But again, practicing, really becoming familiar with your stories and learning the cadence of the STAR method will take you far, I promise. So action items for folks that are doing the Greenlight program, there's quite a few things to be doing here. So we have additional videos that I did not show today because we have been on this video for quite a while, or on this one. But so we have a couple additional videos on our website. I also have a video from one of our alumni who is talking through two situations, one about like solving a problem and the other one was about a failure. Also, we want you to use that STAR story matrix. And so for folks that are doing Greenlight, please work on building out two stories. The first, which is telling about a time you needed to adapt or pivot due to an unexpected situation. So there was kind of a hitch in the giddy up, something went awry. These are the stories that I'll hear. Well, someone will say, our team was working on a presentation for our client that we were going to be giving in 10 days. And then my leader came in and said, we need to give that in 2 days. Here's what we did to get everybody up to speed, brought everybody together, built out a new project plan, et cetera, et cetera. Then the second story we'd like for you to prepare is telling about a time you needed to persuade someone else to see your way of thinking or secure buy-in. So that's where I'm listening for how you connected with the other person that you're trying to persuade, like how you were connecting with what they needed in order to kind of shift their perspective. Are they moved, influenced by data, by story, by relationship? How are they influenced? How you figured that out and how you moved it forward. So watching some additional videos, because obviously my examples are not that thorough, but we have wonderful examples that have already been recorded for you. And again, the more you start to see and hear how stories are told, the more it starts to imprint in your mind. So thanks so much for sticking with me through this one, and we'll see you in the next video.